Hello, thank you for coming for this interview today. Let's start with your name. So, what's your name and what do you do identify as doing currently in the industry?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Cal, and I am a graphics engineer currently working at Unity Technologies in Japan. And so I'm based in Japan, and I've been working in the games industry for roughly 5 years now. Yeah,
Oh,
very nice to be here.
that's good. Nice. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what you actually do in in the industry, like terms of your work?
hmm Sure. So basically, I work on game engines, and in terms of career path, so I started my career at Capcom, and I was studying in university here, right? And then after I joined Capcom, I started working in the engine team. And so in the department that handles, the in-house engine that Capcom uses to make games, they had like different teams. And so I was on the rendering team for that department. And then since then, I've transitioned to Unity Technologies. Some of you might know. So it's a company that makes a game engine. And the same, I work on graphics for games and optimizing games, working with studios basically to, you know, increase performance, debug stuff, kind of like if the studios need features that might not be currently existing in the engine, we can do some customization as well. And it's just like working alongside people who use the Unity engine to, make better games. And yeah, that's basically
Okay,
the
that's
general gist of it, right?
yeah. Well, that's really cool. You mentioned here. Are you talking about Japan or um,
Yeah.
so you
So
studied in Japan,
we,
or because I know you did grow up in France. So how did
mm,
that come about?
right. Yeah. So I'm originally from France and I grew up in Europe, right? The deal was that I was in a university doing engineering and software engineering, essentially in France. And they had this like double degree, like dual program thing with a university in Japan. So I applied to that and I joined that university in Japan. And that allowed me to sort of like put a foot in their sort of like very peculiar recruiting system that is like very centered on a specific calendar. So you can only join, very traditional Japanese companies as a fresh graduate through this kind of system, which is well, kind of like makes it easier, right, to join those companies. Because you only have like that status of fresh graduate basically the year after your graduation. And a lot of companies here look for those. They have a proper system to basically specifically recruit for those fresh graduates. But I wasn't really aiming for that at the beginning. So my rough goal was to sort of like do something related with computer science, right? Because like that was like sort of my aim all the way back when I was still in France. And I did do some internships related to like more general software engineering for like stuff with banks and, information systems, that kind of stuff as well. Anything like sort of big data as well, like was very sort of buzzwordy, and sort of like trendy as well back then. And, a lot of courses were around that. But I knew that I wanted to get into computer science and IT, and I knew that I wanted to experience living in Japan as well. And so those were the goals. And then when I started aligning them and then coming to Japan, then, here the games industry is much more like back in France, when you say, okay, I had friends, who wanted to work in games back in Europe. It's sort of like still a little bit of a niche thing, depending on where you are, at least in the type of university where I was, where it was like, we had all sorts of engineering, like chemical engineering, like mechanics and all sort of that. And among that, even in computer science, like working in the games industry, it's not as systematically, the recruiting process is not as big and it's not as systematically like, well, based on a sort of foundation as here in Japan, right? Because the companies in France, like, we have Ubisoft and companies like that are very big and famous, but it's not as broad and as big, I'd say, as whereas in Japan, it's just like a lot of kids and they're just like way back in middle school. They know that, they have like this environment and ecosystem, like companies in Japan and industry of games that you can strive to apply for. And so I discovered that coming to Japan, and around me, people were jumping into that sort of recruiting system that I talked about, like, the fresh graduate thing.
Yeah.
So I sort of like thought, why not as well try? And that's sort of like how I got into the first job, right?
Okay, that sounds really interesting because sounds like a bit of like a different culture shock, and seems like Japan has much more a robust system as you just described. Was it like harder for you to adapt because it was so different, or?
I don't think it was harder, because that was basically in a sort of way, that was only the only system I knew of, in terms of professional, because I only have experience working in Japan, right? So like after graduating, I directly joined a company here and I started working here. Although I did like some internships back in Europe. And as for the recruiting system as well, like in France, we do have some requirements for internships, like spread out throughout the curriculum of our like university years. So like in the type of school I was, there was a criteria that you had to fulfill, and you had to like have an internship on your third year for like a minimum of 2 months or something like that. And then fourth year or like fifth year, something like that, you had to have like literally half a year of internship. But because I did this double degree thing, I didn't need those internships, because like that was sort of cut off. And then I directly came to Japan, and that we were on a sort of like a separate track.
Okay.
So it didn't feel as different, because like I knew that it was different compared to what my peers would be doing back in France. If I had stayed in France, I would be doing something else, or like facing another system. But the system that I went through in Japan was basically the only one that I knew as well at that point. So I sort of just like worked with it.
Okay.
Right.
Because at the moment where this is an Australian event, do you know if someone from Australia as a student would want to do the same system or similar systems overseas, like for example in Japan, do you know there's a similar pathway they could take, or how would they tackle that if they want to get into that Japan industry?
I actually know. So like the way it works is like it's very generational, right? Like fresh graduates, they all join this specific year. And then the next year, every year around this particular period of, when people graduate around March, they have a window, a bunch of people join. And then it's the same year round thing. So even when you join the company, you sort of have this like
a cohort?
Group of peers. Yeah, like exactly a cohort that you joined with. And so in my cohort in Capcom, I actually had an Australian guy who applied from Australia to Capcom, and he was accepted as well. And it was fairly international. Like it wasn't like 50-50, or of course it's still like a Japanese process, and applying from overseas, it makes it even in some ways harder because of like time zones and documentation, or like administrative process, that kind of stuff. I don't know if there's a similar path in Australia, because I'm not too familiar with the Australian system, but I can talk a lot about how good I think this particular Japanese process was, or at least how I perceived it, compared to like the situation that I see in Europe or broader in the Western, like Northern America side of things in the industry, right? Because what I really felt is that I think like, everybody who's here studying and maybe potentially interested in games, and right, we know that there's, especially nowadays, like there's a lot of competition. The industry isn't maybe at the healthiest point in its history. In terms of like, harsh competition, and how hard it is to get a foot into the industry, and how hard it is to look for those internships.
Yes.
But the interesting thing with the Japanese system was that, well, I was seeing, the amount of like junior jobs and junior positions maybe sort of decreasing, and it's like not really a given that companies would recruit juniors. The companies here in Japan, like they all have this systematic thing of like getting fresh graduates, and the trade-off is sort of like conditions. What I mean conditions is more like maybe the base pay, or like the amount of like holidays that you might get on your first year, right? These, if you compare to like Northern America or like Europe, maybe it's not going to be exactly on par, right? But what I feel is that for a first job, and the Japanese system, it has this sort of like very long-standing process of like recruiting students fresh out of the university in a huge scale, and these companies also use and pour a lot of money into training and giving the industry required skills to those freshly graduated students or like fresh recruits even after they join. So like I had almost 8 months, I think, of training even after I joined, which is not a given in Western companies, I feel like, or at least from what I hear,
That sounds
because
really
you're
good,
more
yeah.
expected. Yeah, it is. And I think it's very important as well, because that's where I learned so much stuff that I think is more difficult to learn in university, just because of we, at least for what we deal with in graphics and platforms and things like that. The first thing is that there's a bunch of NDAs, right, that you can't in games, working on consoles and things like that. We know there's like talking about graphics backends and things like that. You might have heard of like DirectX, Vulkan, things like that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of stuff. And shaders, right? There's the stuff that you can learn online and at university. And then when you start working with proprietary vendors and, whether it's like vendors of like a specific console, they have like their own environment, and they have their own know-how of dealing with that console, and they have their own know-how, like their sort of like own backend and own way of like developing for that console that you can only start learning when you put your foot into the first job. So
now let's talk about more your experience in the job.
That was like kind of all of it.
But like, no, that was really good. Let's stick with Capcom, because like this is where you started.
Mm-hmm.
So what was it like working at a AAA studio like Capcom? Because that's your first step into the game industry, and then we'll lead on to how you ended up in Unity.
Yeah. So it was very exciting. Like it was kind of it's going to appear very cliche, but it's kind of like a dream come true as well, because my favorite series of games, like from all time, was the Monster Hunter series, right? And I used to play those games back at school a lot as well, and I would have never expected like that my name, would once land into the credits of one of those games, and it did happen, right? So that's sort of like the exciting part of it. And I think that's like what's really great about the industry, because a lot of people around me were feeling the exact same kind of enthusiasm, and there's like this kind of atmosphere that, okay, everybody at the company is really passionate about the company's legacy in terms of, games and IPs, and what the reason why they applied is because, they love those games and they want to be a part of it. And the job itself as well, I think there are a lot of things you can look for in a job in terms of like how rewarding it is, how it teaches you things, how you can level up as well, and especially as a first job, right? It's like sort of your first stepping stone into the industry. I think it's very important, and I think that, at least in my case, a lot of like fundamental things that I would want from a first job were achieved at Capcom, namely we talked about a little bit, like the training period, right? You want a company that really invests in you, right? Like sort of like takes the time and invest the money into training you and putting the solid foundations, I mean, to sort of like ensure that you will be able to have those skills to build a great career. And it's also important, I think, because Japan, there's still like this little bit of stigma around like working conditions, overtime, and things like that as well. I had a great experience in my team. Some people in other teams had a significantly more amount of overtime, I think. Yeah, but it's kind of depending on. I would say it depends more on the team than the culture, right? So even now, like we're in Australia, right? Looking at the industry, other studios across the globe, I know places, that sort of like earn a lot and have like a lot of, depending on it's not like the whole like working environment is not depending as much on the country you're in, whereas the company or the team itself. So what I can say is that I had, my direct manager and like a direct like tech lead who was very intent on, leaving on time. So that was like sort of the thing. And, his boss would come up to him and ask him a question past, he's like 5 minutes past his working hour, and he was like, "Oh no, I'm out," and wait till tomorrow, right? And that was be in Japan in front of everybody else in the team, right? So like sort of set the mood and set like the expectations for everybody across the department. So that's what's important, really. It's kind of difficult as well because you can't know what kind of team you're going to land into, and you can't know that at any stage of interviewing for a company, but you do get hints around that as well a little bit. And I think you can sort of probe that while looking for companies and while interviewing with those companies as well. So I think it's something that I noticed while working at Capcom and retrospectively noticing that okay, that was very good and I was lucky to have that, right? But outside of that, yeah, the daily job is just it's basically if somebody who doesn't know anything about games just like takes a step back and look at the way I work from a third person perspective is just like a sort of office job, except the office is like decorated with like lots of fantasy artwork or whatever. But especially on my side, is just like spending your day in front of a computer, like writing programs and things like that.
Yeah, speaking of
But from
that,
time to yeah.
what do you do at Unity then?
hmm Pretty much the same. It's interesting because so what I forgot mentioning at the beginning is that I work on the tech side, right, for engines. So I don't work directly on the games and the game's content. What I do is that I work for the people making the game's content. And my job is to make sure that, they have the best tools and they have the best environment and their work goes smoothly, right? And that's sort of like my motivation. That's what I like doing in this industry. And Unity is pretty much the same, right? So we make a game engine, we work with studios to improve that engine, and then we work with the studios as well on their content to sort of like help them out when they have like questions or like issues with the engine and things like that. And from that, we take the feedback and then try to improve, the tools and the things that we make depending on how they're getting used. And I think this is like sort of one of the most interesting and rewarding aspects because, well, at least for my job, is because just of it's kind of again a thing that you hear from time to time, but you never can expect. Like when you're making tools and you're making tech, you're building tech, you never can't like expect people to behave a certain way or like people to use your tools a certain way because they will always find like a
That
way
sounds like a
to
typical issue with all
yeah.
IT developers, the user
Exactly.
end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm not an exception to that as well. So it's like, but it's very fun as well because it's about games and it's about like creativity, right? So in that sense, they always come to us with like these crazy ideas and okay things that they want to execute, and we're just like here like okay let's do this, and um, that's like the fun part of it, right? But it's kind of similar to what I used to do at Capcom as well. So as somebody on the engine side, I'm more like at the service of people who actually make the games, the artists, the programmers who directly work on the game content. The only thing that changed between Capcom and Unity was that in Capcom, the people who were using my tools and my like code or whatever on the engine were same employees of Capcom internally, just from another department. And in Unity, it's just that we're not in the same company anymore. There's like we're from different companies. So like there's an institutional, like administrative, different sort of like grouping, but the dynamic of like making engine and my clients, if you could call them clients, are basically other people making games, and this doesn't change from what I used to do from Capcom and Unity. Yeah.
Okay. So with the last few minutes, let's talk about some. How did you find what you learned at uni, like the skills you learned as an IT, like translate to what you've done, like you're doing right now? So just to give a little idea to other students that like the skills they're learning are valuable, and you actually use them.
Yeah, I think on the tech side, I was in a sort of like curriculum or track that did a lot of like math, algorithmics, and things that, I mean, obviously, when doing computer science in university, you're going to learn the basics about, anything related to programming languages up until, object-oriented programming, memory management, like, algorithmics, and you're going to maybe touch upon a little bit of rendering, a little bit of like data structures and how to write an efficient program. All of that obviously is very, very important. And it's like sort of like the basic
Foundations.
pool of knowledge, that we do expect from anybody from a junior position up until senior, and to have sorted out, and that's like a given, right? So it's very good that you get that sort of like knowledge in university. I did find out that trigonometry is important, right?
Oh,
That's
no.
like the
Math teachers.
that's like
they didn't lie.
yeah, and that's the crazy thing. Like, did I expect, as a high school student, getting bashed with trigonometry and
Well, to be fair,
algebra and all of that?
graphics. You're doing
Yeah,
metric maths. So.
right. Yeah, and matrices exactly. Yeah, and all of that. Because I wasn't fully intent on going the way of games and 3D, especially programming when I was studying that stuff. But after graduating completely and getting my job at Capcom on Unity, and started doing like 3D maps, and that is like, yeah.
Did you
So
get
it
your
is
old pen
important,
and paper
and
out and start writing?
yeah. I have a friend actually. Yeah, he still keeps all his like engineering high school books and university books, and like every so often, like couple of months even, he has to literally just like go back to his library like thing and pick up his book and go find that like obscure math problem that
You
is
heard it from
sort of
Carl.
yeah.
Maths is important, okay?
Yeah, it is, unfortunately or
Yeah.
fortunately, but
Okay. Any
yeah,
last
and
minute? Yeah, continue.
yeah. So I do have like about skills to learn and care about as well. I do have a little thing to emphasize as well,
Yeah.
because the something we deal with in games which might not be as obvious in the realm of CG or graphics compared to like offline things like film or VFX, which is still important but in games, there's like this huge sacred keyword of like performance, right? So I think, and I wish, retrospectively, even for students. So if you can learn or start learning or start even just caring about performance, this is going to take you very far, I think. And everybody's going to be very happy when interviewing or like when working with you on projects and things like that. Because this is something like sort of critical to especially games that we like every project, literally every project I've seen or dealt with, up until the very last second of development, performance is a
Do they
critical, like
use
sacred
things
thing.
like the big O notation? Do they talk about those calculations a lot, or?
It's it's not as much about the theoretical side of performance rather than knowing like what can typically become a bottleneck in the kind of code of assets if you're an artist that you make. And it's more about best practices, I think, because those best practices go a huge way of if you start applying and learning them and making them becoming a habit, then like everybody is gonna thank you for it. It's gonna be like a huge differentiator, I think, for like a skill or like something you care about that you can appeal for while looking for jobs or like even once you have landed your job, right? So like that's sort of the kind of thing I tell a lot of people and a lot of students as well is that yeah, start caring for performance and you're going to make a lot of people happy as well.
Okay.
So
With the
yeah,
final minute, any
yep.
advice for if they want to just generally apply to a game studio of some sort, like to
Hmm.
students?
Be in the loop, I guess. I think a lot of, especially these times, the industry, there's like waves of like ups and downs a little bit. Um, I think a lot of it, which is kind of not, I mean, it's kind of difficult to deal with, but that's the reality. I think a huge part of like landing your first job is being there at the right time, at the right place, kind of. Because the companies on our side, even, just there might not be an opening. We do want to recruit students and juniors and train them, but it's just like timing and a lot of that is unfortunately around, yeah, just the timing and opportunity side. So I think it's not something that you can do in a week or in a day. It's something that you do over the course of even starting right now, putting yourself, in the right places, the right circles, getting to know the right people, and it's sort of like a background process that I think is important to have to think about that can help you down the road, right? So we do have across the industry like opportunities still to meet professionals, and I think a lot of you are already doing that. Hopefully, just keep doing that. Keep trusting the process, having faith, and having fun in what you do, and this is what we look for, right? Like people who have fun and have like because if you sort of like um treat this as a fun process as well. Like this is going to sort of affect your how you approach this and how people like perceive and remember you while you reach out to them and while you sort of connect with them. So yeah, that's basically what I can
Okay.
say.
Well, thank you, Carl. That ends
Yeah.
our interview for today. Bye.